What's up, everyone? Welcome to The Heroic Ethic. I'm your host, Liberty Bill. Today we are going to be talking about nihilism and moral relativity. But before we begin, I want to apologize for the length of time between this and the last video. I think it's been like a week and a half, and that is not the vision that I had for this channel, even though it's a side project for me, and on my main D&D channel, I try and put out a video every other day. I am shooting for like a video or two a week on The Heroic Ethic, and I feel bad that it's been like a week and a half. And that was my own fault because I found myself kind of forgetting the vision that I had for this channel, which was to make philosophy and the heroic ethic more accessible to people. And what I ended up doing, because I have been doing a ton of work, I've been working on it every day, and I put in like 8 hours into it yesterday. But what I was doing was like a really super academic approach. I ended up with like this 5-page outline and dotting every I and crossing every T, and getting everything organized properly and addressing every possible rebuttal. And then I was gonna like read it to you, but I just didn't feel comfortable with it. I decided to sleep on it, and when I woke up today, I realized I was like, man, that was the whole reason that you didn't want to write a book, because it's just too highbrow and too academic and too dry and boring, and no one's gonna listen to it or care. And so that's why I went to YouTube, right? And so it was just silly of me to try and do that again for this channel. And so I've just thrown that all away. I'm not going to fall victim to the sunk cost fallacy. And even though I put on all this work for this essay and this outline and stuff, and I'm just going to talk to you guys about nihilism and moral relativity, just like if we were in a bar and you were all like, hey man, I heard you're a philosopher. Can you explain to me why nihilism's wrong? Because it sounds like it kind of makes sense. And then I'd be like, all right, listen, pull up a chair, you buy the drinks, you got to promise let me talk for like 10 or 15 minutes because it's pretty structured, and I promise I'll probably answer any questions you might have as we go along, but save questions for the end. And yeah, let's do this, man. Nice to meet you, by the way. So yeah, let's talk about nihilism and moral relativity from that perspective. So when you construct any argument, you need to start with epistemology and talk about like the criteria that you're using for truth, and make sure you're all on the same page in that regard. And we did that last time. The next thing you need to do in an argument is define your terms, because otherwise it's this, game of telephone where you're talking past each other, and, I say ethics meaning one thing and you hear ethics thinking that it means another thing, and then it just all gets garbled up. I mean, and this is true just generally speaking, but it's particularly true when it comes to ethics and morality, because people use them in very idiosyncratic ways. People don't use them in conversation in a consistent way. And so it gets really super confusing. So first thing we need to point out is ethics and morality. Is there a difference? What does one mean versus what does the other mean? For the purposes of this channel and this argument and the heroic ethic, we consider ethics and morality to be interchangeable terms. They mean the exact same thing. And I just need to point out, in conversation, a lot of times people do differentiate between the two. I actually kind of think about them in a different way. To me, when I hear ethics, I'm thinking like universal laws that apply to everybody. And when I hear morals, I think of like subjective opinions about what's good or bad. But other people like reverse that, and other people have different definitions for those. So for the sake of clarity, going forward, I will be using morals and ethics interchangeably to refer to the same thing. What is that thing to which they refer to? Morals and ethics refer to codes of conduct of human beings that categorize, define, and advocate certain behaviors towards each other. Right? That's what ethics is, as I am defining it. And this can be confusing, because even with that definition, there's two ways that you can deploy it. One is descriptive morality. The other is normative morality. And not only does this cause problems in conversation, it causes problems in thinking. Because even within your own thinking, it's very easy to create these category errors, particularly when you want to. And most people want to because a lot of premises that we have are emotionally held. We don't really examine them logically. And I'm no different, by the way. I'm 50 years old and my positions have evolved over the years. And I remember, especially when I was young, dismissing all sorts of arguments left and right just because they seemed emotionally wrong. And then 10, 15, 20 years later, I'm, steel manning. I've learned to steel man instead of straw man. And I look at those arguments and I'm like, oh man, this is emotionally uncomfortable, but they might have a point, right? And so descriptive morality versus normative morality. Descriptive morality is just an observation, an empirical observation about what people do in terms of ethics, right? This society is a slave society. This society is not a slave society. This society venerates the golden rule. This society venerates the iron rule. This society is authoritarian and run by men, and this society is communist and run by women, right? It's, just observations about what people do without any kind of moral judgment involved. Whereas normative morality are about oughts. Those are universal, deductively derived frameworks that purport to be accepted by everybody unless they fall into logical contradiction. So that part wasn't very good. So let's try it again. Descriptive morality just describes what people do. Normative morality is about what people should do. And descriptive morality, everybody's different. And in normative morality, everything is universal. And so for the record, going forward, the heroic ethic is about normative morality. Descriptive morality doesn't really apply. Just because this society is a slave society does not in any way justify the morality of slavery. And so I'm not going to really deal with that. I don't really care what people have done in the past. The heroic ethic is about the logical, rational ethics that we can determine from, our premises in reality. So that's what I mean by ethics going forward. They are interchangeable, morals and ethics. They describe codes of conduct that, advocate and define behaviors between human beings. And that's what we're looking at here with the heroic ethic. Now we have to define nihilism and moral relativity. So nihilism is the complete denial that you can have any sort of normative morality at all. It is the non-P, two moralities P. So that's one. The second way is moral relativity, where they say that morality does apply to everybody, but it applies to everybody differently. It applies to everybody relatively based on the individual or the group. And then moral universalism, which says that, morality and ethics apply to every single person, regardless of group or opinion. And so it just kind of makes sense to approach the non-P first. And then I can address moral relativity very quickly, because I said in my epistemology video that I'm not even going to really address it at all because it's freaking silly. And then it makes more sense to look at other formulations of moral universalism and falsify them, like Kant's categorical imperative, like natural rights theory, like utilitarianism, et cetera, et cetera. And so nihilism, again, is a complete denial of any sort of normative morality. And it's built around a pretty strong argument. I mean, nihilism is very persuasive and seductive because it's built on a couple of premises that is very easy to emotionally accept without examining critically. And then they make correct logical inferences to reach logically valid conclusions. And that's why it's, loomed large in philosophy over the last couple hundred years. But let's not forget that all truths, even if they are derived in a particular domain of truth, have to be resonant with all three. It has to be coherent, it has to be correspondent with reality, and it has to be pragmatic in terms of creating successful heuristics. And so while nihilism is very strong in coherence, it actually fails there as even in its strongest argument, and then it completely falls apart when it comes to the other two. So in terms of coherence, nihilism makes the following argument. As a premise, they say that we live in a materialist society that is deterministic. All behavior is due to causal forces that were determined at the Big Bang, and we have no control over it, and that free will is an illusion. Embedded in that premise is a second premise that we need to look at, which is that metaphysics is relevant to ethics. Because if it's not, then, these metaphysical arguments don't make any sense. And that is a very strong argument, because we live in an age of scientism, and it's extremely easy for people to just assume that we are determinist machines and dismiss any other possibility. But there are some problems, because the first premise is indeterminate and the second premise is false. So even though nihilism is logically valid, I argue that it is unsound. So first, in terms of determinism versus free will, and this is a giant discussion, of course, I'll probably do a separate video on it at some point, but here I will simply point out that we don't know. We don't know either way whether determinism or free will exists in a metaphysical sense, because we just don't know enough about the universe. We don't know enough about consciousness. Determinism is an assumption. Free will is also an assumption, but we can't use them as metaphysical premises because we don't yet know. It is just an assumption. And I promise you, I know there are people that are right now having an emotional reaction, wanting to immediately accept determinism and immediately dismiss any non-determinism options. And I'll just say, look, make those arguments in the comments. I will be happy to reveal that they stand on nothing and are ultimately an assumption. I've had this argument a million times. Eventually I'll corner you, and then you'll end up being a compatibilist, which is, basically saying, I want my cake and eat it too, even though it makes no logical sense. So that's problematic. Even if it's true, we don't know that it's true. That is just an assumption. So it is an indeterminate premise. But it doesn't even matter, because the second premise, that metaphysics are relevant to ethics, is 100% false. Metaphysics, the subject matter of metaphysics, is reality itself, the building blocks of this universe that we live in, or this reality that we live in. Ethics is about human beings, right? And that is one level above metaphysics, and it doesn't have any relevance at all, because we are human beings and we are limited. And one of those limits to our perception is that we must perceive the world through a lens of free will. There are no human beings that don't have the perspective of free will. The theoretical scientist that one day manages to put it all together and figure out exactly how we are determinists is not going to immediately cut himself of the puppet strings, he's not going to stop looking at the world from a lens of free will. So when it comes to ethics, which is defined as being about human beings and about how they relate to each other and about how to categorize behavior relative to each other, it's an ultimate given that we have to start with the perceptions of a human being. And so therefore we must assume free will as an ultimate given, below which gets into the realm of metaphysics, which has nothing to do with ethics. So even from a coherent standpoint, which is the strength of nihilism, it is not strong at all. It is very shaky. It rests on an indeterminate assumption that they take advantage of the fact that people emotionally automatically accept it. And they don't state the second embedded premise, which is obviously false. So nihilism has a huge problem in that regard. Nihilism has an even bigger problem when it gets to correspondence, because when you're looking at it empirically, the human being is not just limited in its hardwiring to have the perspective of free will. There are two other major limitations to it. One, it can only look at the world through its logical structure of mind. We cannot even imagine a square circle. We cannot even imagine someone who is both pregnant and not pregnant, right? All of these basic laws of logic are hardwired and embedded into our perspective, and we simply cannot get rid of it. The third thing that limits human beings is what I call the moral structure of mind. Ethics and morals, they're not just something that we invented. They're something that is hardwired into our very neurological structure. Even babies demonstrate primitive proto-ethics. Even animals demonstrate certain proto-ethics. And just as an example, some people may not be aware, but human beings greatly differentiate from chimpanzees in that we have an ethical instinct towards reciprocity, right? Chimpanzees don't have that, and so they can never reward or punish anyone for their contributions. Whereas human beings, we have that reciprocity, and that forced us to work together, right? And then we're able to climb out of the trees thereby. So the fact that we have certain hardwired moral and ethical structures built into our brains is a fact of nature. It is empirically undeniable. And that is 100% counter to the assertions of nihilists. And that's a problem. You can't just stay in the coherent theory of truth. It has to be resonant with correspondence and pragmatism, and it fails in correspondence. So even in coherence, it's shaky and wrong. It is 100% wrong when it comes to correspondence. But pragmatism is where nihilism really goes off the rails, because it should be immediately apparent that nihilism does not work. It just does not lead to superior outcomes. If you're a nihilist and are logically consistent, you are a criminal. You're living in the underworld. You are not obeying any ethics at all. You are doing whatever you can to come out ahead, and you don't care about anybody else, right? But most nihilists don't go there. Most nihilists just kind of get comfortable in a hypocritic cognitive dissonance, where they say, oh, well, I believe in nihilism, but to go along and get along, I'm actually going to follow these descriptive ethical structures by which my society works. And this is going to allow me to take advantage of the benefits of civilization. And in terms of pragmatism, they get so hypocritical, right? But you simply can't live a nihilist philosophy and come out ahead yourself. It's not pragmatic at all. And so that's actually one of the reasons that I'm always willing to talk to nihilists, because ultimately, if we disagree about the logical arguments or whatever, it doesn't matter as long as they are willing to behave like heroes, right? There's no thought crime in the heroic ethic. And as long as you follow the 3 simple rules behaviorally, then I'm going to consider you a hero. And I don't really care if you agree with it from a coherence perspective or not. And nihilists can get on board the heroic ethic because I actually put forward really strong pragmatic arguments that say, look, even if you don't believe that there are absolute morals and ethics, you are way better off acting as if you do, and in fact, acting in this particular way that I described in the heroic ethic. So nihilists are potential allies. We can come to agreement in terms of pragmatism. That is not true when it comes to moral relativists. Moral relativists are really the great enemies of heroes because they come from a completely different epistemology. Don't forget, nihilists have accepted all of our epistemology. They're making logical, coherent arguments, right? And then they try to support it with empirical evidence and yada, 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 right? So if we can come to agreement within that epistemology, heroes and nihilists can work together. But moral relativists are perspectivists and polylogists. They dismiss any kind of common ground for discussion. They simply say, well, you belong to the out-group, so I don't have to listen to you. And ultimately, and don't take this personally, moral relativists, but they always initiate aggression. They always have to force people to go along with their arbitrary frameworks because, surprisingly, they're always in the favored group. And they believe they're owed something by unfavored groups, and then they initiate aggression against them. And as heroes, if you initiate aggression against me or anyone I care about, which guess what, is all of humanity, I'm going to have a problem with that. And I feel and will argue that I am morally justified in defending myself against moral relativity. And I would love to talk to moral relativists and get us all on the same page. But the problem is that they simply will not listen to anything I say because they have an epistemology of polylogism, right? Their logic applies to them, but it doesn't apply to me, right? Because they're, bourgeoisie and I'm proletariat, or they're a Christian and I'm Jew, or they're an Ubermensch and I'm, a Christian slave morality, or they're black and I'm white, if we want to bring it into the modern day. I'm not actually white, but you know what I'm saying. You can't talk to those people. And really it just comes to, well, okay, here's a line and behind it is all of my stuff, including my body. And if you try and take them because you think that I'm like the oppressor and you're the victim, sorry, too bad. You're not getting it. And I regret that. I don't like having to not talk. I prefer to talk first, but this is a philosophy of heroism. The third pillar of power is there for a reason, and I will talk about that when the time comes. All right. Anyway, so we've defined our terms, and I've gone off on a little bit of a tangent about nihilism and moral relativity. But let's look at. Actually, no. Do I need to look at anything? I think that might be it. Right. So. Okay, yeah, let's cut it here. No need to talk too much longer. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below. To sum up, I don't want to deal with moral relativity at all. That's polylogism. We can't even have a rational discussion. In terms of nihilism, it's strongest in coherence, but it falls apart because its first premise is not true but indeterminate. Its second premise is false. It doesn't correspond to the reality of the moral structure of mind, and it falls completely apart when you try to create heuristics that lead to successful outcomes. So next time, I think we will talk about the Lockean proviso as I start dialing in and starting to talk about actually how I build the philosophy. Thank you so much for watching. This has been The Heroic Ethic. I'm your host, Liberty Bill. See you next time.